Mom, is global warming gonna kill us?
We're just gonna have to wait and see.
When I first started watching The Simpsons, it struck me as a tad bit odd. My experience with the show beforehand had been purely from seeing it mentioned here and there in passing. One of the main things I remember being mentioned about the show was the whole prediction thing, where people would claim that The Simpsons predicted a huge event decades before they had actually happened. And to an unassuming child, this gave the show sort of a mystical, mysterious aura. It also, in a sense, made the show seem scary and less approachable than most other shows at the time. And this isn't exactly helped by the constant discussions regarding the show's dark humor and aggressive decline, which further added to that unfriendly nature. But as I started watching through the series, I started to realize how little of that mystique and or mystery contributed to the actual contents of the show. It led me to really start considering something I had never really tried to think about before, which is how the show might be perceived by a more casual audience member whose sole association with the show is the internet. A person who started out like me.
Less yelling, more foretelling.
So, I'll be attempting to break down all the different ways the internet has morphed The Simpsons and how it affected and continues to affect how it is seen by casual audiences, and maybe take a look at how it might have changed the trajectory and legacy of the show as a whole, and maybe debunk some false claims that behold the show when viewed by the mainstream audience.
What if
You don't want to know how far I'll go.
One thing that we touched upon for a little bit in the opening, and what is probably the thing that is most synonymous with the show and its current legacy, has to be its supposed supernatural ability to predict the future. Predict in quotations because they're often kind of on the silly side of things. These predictions aren't as real as they might seem. The interesting thing with these predictions is that the way they've been distributed over the internet has evolved. Like, I wouldn't call the first instance of The Simpsons predictions really malicious or traced with bad intentions. It's just people making stuff up to have a little fun with the show. But as time went on, the predictions evolved into exploitations used by clickbait channels to twist the narrative around the show in order to gain money based off clicks. And when this caught on, The Simpsons became known for somehow predicting the future. This then evolved to the newest version of this that we know today, which is the AI Simpsons predictions, which are just awful, and people fall for them all the time. And there has been tons and tons of these kinds of predictions over the years. They get really strange. There was one back in 2020 where someone edited a scene from the show to say that The Simpsons predicted the COVID outbreak, or the really funny prediction with the edited image of the Queen that everyone who hasn't watched the show believed at the time. Now, as we've explained, up until this point, you could still call these predictions relatively harmless. They're not harming anybody, just people messing around with people who aren't fans. But with the new spread of AI, these predictions received a new evil coat of paint, where people would make up these AI images of obviously fake scenes that the public who haven't seen much episodes would believe, which would cause a spread of people believing that the show can see the future. And look, it's funny and sad at the same time, because on one hand, it's funny that people would think that the same show that produced scenes like this
Sugar do 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 do. Honey honey do 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 do.
would be some all-knowing series. But on the other hand, it sets a bad precedent for what the show is. Like I mentioned previously, when I first heard about the show, I always viewed it as this unfriendly, scary show, and these predictions hammer that home tenfold, as it gives the casual audience this weird notion about the show, that it is something to be afraid of, something that gives you anxiety upon hearing about it. Cause as far as you know, the show only exists purely to make you afraid of the future, when that is in no way true. It only exists to give you hope. That's what the show is about. And to give you some perspective, 90% of The Simpsons predictions have been false, with 5% being coincidental stretches, and the other 5% being predictions made about itself. These numbers are fake, I just made them up, but my point still stands, that for the most part, they hold no merit. The stuff like,
They'll never stop the Simpsons. Have no fear
is just like mentioned before, predictions about its own self. And I mean, you can't really call predictions about itself predictions anyhow. The writers have access to their own writer's room. They know when they're running out of ideas. So those things aren't much predictions as they are logical assumptions made from the showrunners sensing their own burnout. Now, all this set a narrative around the show that, at least to me as a casual audience member of the show, made me feel that the show was less approachable, which is the last thing you want for your show. Now moving right along to the other crazy delusions that define the show's legacy, especially in the classic era, and what is largely consistent with how it's perceived by the casual audience, is the view of the show as some nihilistic, depressing family drama. And while that could be true, depending on how you look at the show, everyone can see it differently. It fails to showcase the heartwarming, often overly sappy aspects of the show that make it what it is. Again, when I first heard about the show, this is the main thing that contributed to me fearing the show. The internet had morphed it into this object of fear, a more miserable watch than any other adult animated cartoon, when it's not even remotely on the same level. I think this takes us back to the prediction debate, where the audience that have seen the show would perpetuate a narrative that the show is something it's not, in order to garner more views. Like, yes, The Simpsons could be sad. Homer's Odyssey is a prime example from the early era. But how does Homer's Odyssey end? With depression? With sadness? No. It ends with hope for the future. Now again, it's really funny that a show with episodes like Bart Gets an Elephant and Deep Space Homer could even be considered on the same depressing level as shows like that, when it is in reality very silly, one of the silliest shows on TV. Part of this notion comes from shows that followed after The Simpsons, like South Park, Family Guy, and King of the Hill, which all had much heavier themes. Well, I don't think heavier is the right word, but they were definitely more graphic, and The Simpsons, compared to them, is relatively tame. Now, what can we do to stop these false narratives? Well, not much really. People will continue making fake predictions, and they'll continue portraying The Simpsons as an evil sitcom. There's a reason Dark Simpsons is so popular, no comment beyond that. But there is one thing we can all do. Whenever these points are brought up, always make sure to give counterpoints and disprove the lies. Matt Selman even went out of his way to disprove one of the AI predictions. That's how bad things got that the showrunner had to step in. And you can do the same. Don't let the mainstream legacy of the show be predictions, be depression. Embrace that the show is wacky silliness, and will always be that. Thanks for watching. I'm sure this video came off as a bunch of weird ramblings, but I don't know. Until next time.